finally. Hopefully you guys are all awake-ish or something, but yeah, so I'm going to go talk about the Zcash trusted setup, and as many of you know, I was involved, but I think a good way to start is really, well, what is it? And looks like a bit of toxic waste, and long story short is, Zcash has some very advanced privacy technology, ZK snarks. And basically it means that if I have a Zcash coin and I send it to you, where that coin came from is essentially completely secret. It could have been any other Zcash coin in existence. But to make this math work, you essentially need to create toxic waste. And a way to think about crypto terms is it's kind of like a private key to the public key that proves these proofs. And if you have access to that, you can create Zcash out of thin air. So needless to say, you want to make sure your toxic waste is fully disposed of. And the process they came up with is called multi-party computation. And this picture here, this is their diagram right off the Zcash website. And essentially the idea is that multiple people come together to collaboratively create this toxic waste in such a way that, at least in theory, you need all of the, in our particular case, 6 people to collude to actually generate that waste for real in one place. It'd be as though you could have a nuclear reactor where somehow the waste is sort of dematerialized into 6 other dimensions. And that all sounds well and good. And this particular arrangement we had is you've got your cloud there, which I think was an Amazon EC2 instance, all coordinating stuff, some network machines communicating to that, and then an air gap. And that air gap, as you'll see later, was DVDs. And you'd pass information through there, and collaboratively, we would take our compute nodes, hopefully isolated from the internet, communicate with each other through this air gap, and ultimately do the mathematical computation to make it all happen. Sounds simple enough. So how did I end up with this? Well, my involvement with Zcash goes way, 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 way back. This is an email from Matthew Green from 2014. And back then, he was working on something called Zero Coin, which is a similar concept to Zcash, but using different cryptography under the hood. And there's advantages and disadvantages, but long story short, he wanted to make this happen. And back in 2014, it was in vogue for people to go and call me chief scientist of their stuff. Now, I'd only started working in crypto full-time for a few months at this point, so I guess no one noticed I like to say bad things about their projects. But fast forward a bit, Zuko got involved, and we had some discussions, and long story short, we got to the point where he wanted to go hire me, but ultimately we had kind of some conflicts, and I always thought this email was kind of interesting because, essentially I'm saying, well, if you would rather go, if you don't want to work with me because of how I go talk about stuff, that's all well and good, but what exactly, how exactly do you go and make this evaluation? What do the people you work with think of, say, Gavin Andresen? As it turned out later, he went and hired Gavin, and as we all know, Gavin then later went and supported Craig Wright. So I think we probably were better enough not to try to work together professionally, but we'll see. Still, though, we still kept on chatting, and when they did finally get a product out and get ready to launch, they actually asked me to go and give a quote about, what I thought of Zcash, and all seemed reasonable enough, and that's actually what I gave. I have to commend Zcash for having the courage to deploy ZK snarks. New crypto isn't for the faint of heart. Had Zcash been deployed a year ago, the whole system might have been taken down by an unfortunate bug. And what that actually refers to is an inflation bug their initial implementation had. And they're really lucky to have caught it about a month prior, but they did, and at least that time around things worked. As we know, they had another one more recently, which again could have taken the system down, but I'm not really surprised they didn't decide to use that quote. Still, even further on, when they finally came to do the ceremony, they again asked me, and that's actually my first contact from Zuko about this. And I thought this was interesting because Zuko asked me this over unencrypted Twitter direct message. And as I say there, doing this is kind of dangerous because you're going and potentially compromising anyone you go and invite. This is a lot of money at stake. Currently the Zcash market cap, I think, is about $500 million. The very peak was, I think, 2 or 3 billion. And with this amount of money at stake, you really got to think about what risks you're exposing to others. So, in my particular case, I wasn't too worried, but I honestly don't think it was the most responsible thing to do. But in any case, I did end up saying yes, and we had some back and forth, and eventually we kind of got that all settled, and I decided to come up with a plan for, well, what would I actually do for the trusted setup? And part of the security of this is you don't want the adversary to know. If you're going to have these air-gapped machines, I don't want the bad guys to know what type of machine I have, what sort of setup I have. I want them to be guessing. So as Zuko and I talked, I soon decided, well, I wouldn't actually go tell him what I was doing for the trusted setup. I would just ask for a budget and do something, and he'd find out later. And in fact, of the 6 people who participated in this, no one but Zuko knew I was involved. There's actually one other group who I think to this day still hasn't, may have not even still been revealed. It certainly was for a while. And then some people were well known, of course, Zuko themselves. And this was my plan. Let's go and rent a car, get some laptops, and travel across a big chunk of BC. And why would you do that? Well, if you have a compute node and you're worried about that bad guys getting access to it, if you're hurtling down a highway at 100 kilometers per hour, all the threats have to come from essentially you, within your car. Things like cell phone, things like, bugs planted and stuff like that. I think, long story short, I've done a pretty good job of rolling that stuff out. And what you see there is actually, so the one on the left is my personal laptop, which I was just using to connect to a cell phone, basically. The one on the right's a network node, and then the one in the tinfoil-lined box is the compute node. And you run the computation there, you burn CDs, move them back and forth to the network node, ultimately get to the internet. And I did a big write-up on this, and there's more detail, but obviously this is really cool and sexy stuff, and it's the Canadians' Rockies Odyssey, hurling down through the Rockies with beautiful mountains on either side and wonderful rocks. And well, actually, that's not really true. These 2 photos were actually on the trip back after the whole ceremony was done. What actually happened was a cypherpunk desert bus, because the Canadian Rockies don't have very good cell phone service. So what I actually did is I went off to a certain part of BC, plateau area, where there's a lot of forestry, mining, industry in general, a lot of trucks, and good cell phone service. Unfortunately, the reason why there's a lot of forestry, mining, et cetera, is because it's kind of flat and boring. And yeah, that's kind of what most of it looks like. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of trees, and that's about it, really. As you can see, they get really creative with their names up there. 95-mile house, 100-mile house, 105-mile house. That pretty much sums up what you can go see there. The chasm is nice, but yeah. And beautiful sights to see, a nice pulp mill. It was sort of the end of the trip in, I can't remember off the top of my head, but why would you? It's an industry town full of pulp mills. Although at least I did get a nice selfie. And at the end, well, you had the dramatic scenes of us taking our compute nodes and burning them and ensuring all the evidence was gone and the secrets would be disappeared and so on and so forth. And, they did the same. I think that's Zuko there with their compute node, destroying it with an angle grinder for some reason and so on. And I wrote all this up and made some big 28-page blog post. And, as you can see, not everyone necessarily liked it, but I thought I did a reasonably good job, and a lot of people seemed to say good things about it. And, There's one of the many write-ups that came up, Peter Todd running all his computations on a laptop and tinfoil, cardboard box, et cetera, et cetera. And again, one of these stations maybe even be impossible to get the key. And of course, the question you really got to ask is, how true is this really? And, my write-up, this is actually section 1.1 and 1.2, right up at the very top. And first of all, nothing changes the fact that as much as I can go write up this big story, you're still trusting me. You're still trusting me and a few other guys. And even if, we say all this great stuff, ultimately nothing could have stopped I and Zuko and so on from compromising the setup. This is just reality. And secondly, there's a single point of failure. How did I actually generate the key? Well, of course, I didn't, sit there with an abacus and flip numbers back and forth. No, I used software. I used software running on hardware that did magic from my point of view, but do I really know what's happening? No, I really don't. I'm just some guy typing in commands onto a keyboard. And unless that software gets audited, how does anyone know what it did? How do I know what this computer's doing? Reality is I kind of don't. And, I think this is actually a really serious issue because, to be honest, I shouldn't have written that write-up. I had this great story about how I did this, this, and this, but the reality is it was all based on one artifact that at that point hadn't been audited. This is, like I say in my disclaimer paragraph, cryptographic hocus-pocus meaning nothing. Until you do that foundational part, how do you know what's actually happened? When you look at the diagram, player 1, 2, 3, these aren't independent systems. These systems are essentially one party, that one piece of software that we all ran. So I think the question is, what did that software look like? What's behind that? Well, we all ran a DVD that was generated. So that DVD had a full Linux distribution. That DVD, we all booted off of. We kept copies of it, but how do you go audit what's on that DVD? Well, that's the first line of the build script that actually built that DVD. And Alpine is a Linux distribution. September 19 is a particular day they just picked. So essentially, they took a not that well-known Linux distribution right before the ceremony started, picked some random day, and said, "All right, we're going to make that the base of everything." Well, how do I know it went into that Linux distribution? See, I kind of don't. All that software, again, that's hundreds of megabytes worth of binaries, and no one can really disassemble that in a reasonable way. No one can, reverse engineer what it did. So there's your basis, That's one of your roots of trust. Anyone with access to that distro on that day, they had full access to the entire ceremony because everything we ran was on top of that. That's your fundamental base. And actually, it gets worse, too, because on top of that, of course, we had a version of Rust that was used to compile all this. Well, how is Rust compiled? Some guy running some server somewhere compiles Rust. How do you know what happened? Well, you kind of don't. No one can replicate that process of compiling that Rust compiler. So again, you've got dozens of megabytes worth of instructions that realistically no human being can go and reverse engineer and interpret. And what's the timing on that? Well, that Rust release was literally released the day prior. And the rationale there was, someone found a bug in Rust and, could have compromised the ceremony. But let's ask ourselves, if that kind of thing can compromise the ceremony, how exactly? These computers are supposed to be in, tinfoil-lined boxes with no communications to the outside world. They're supposed to have the radios removed. Everything's supposed to be going through, supposedly write-once DVDs, which incidentally isn't true. A DVD, of course, can be rewritten after you've burned it the first time because the chemistry doesn't stop being able to change. But even then, so I think really this was actually a big failure. And we also have one more issue too, which is, when I got into this, part of my thinking on why a trusted setup would be okay was because of privacy. It's supposed to be that if the trusted setup gets compromised, privacy is still protected. And as it turns out, that's not strictly true. Again, you have this issue where the result of the setup needs to be verified. And if you don't verify it, well, it turns out you can go and do the setup in a way where the actual computations that the Zcash node does aren't correct and don't actually protect privacy. Now, this is different than the rest of the trusted setup, where in theory you can detect this, but as of right now, no one's actually written the code to do this. And if you've been following this, there's also a whole bunch of other issues where, for instance, the transcript for the setup to actually rerun the software, that was missing for a while because of an inflation bug they had, and so on and so forth. But I think the bigger issue there is really, you've got a great pile of math, but have you done the hard work? Have you done the work to really verify that this happened correctly? And frankly, I don't think Zcash really did. This is an example of one of the very few issues raised by other people trying to replicate this deterministic build. And as you can see there, well, someone noticed that one of the URLs was broken in the build system, and it just wouldn't work, and it was merged over a year later. I don't really think this is indicative of a team that actually wants to have, put in the effort for people to go and check, did this actually work? And this is one of two issues I noticed. The other being that the version of Rust they used, well, they, in the build scripts, specified it as stable, not which version. And of course, if another stable version is released, none of the builds match. Which makes me wonder, did the first team even notice this? Because had they actually fixed this issue, they would have been stopped by the next thing, and it's not really clear anyone actually replicated this. So on the one hand, you have people hurtling down highways, with tinfoil-lined boxes and compute nodes in them and fancy, images of computers getting burnt, but we're not actually fixing really, really basic build issues. That's actually your line of code right there. Rust up default stable, and all you had to do was make that one single line to make it work again. It worries me. And you get this issue of Morgan Peck's phone. She's a journalist who covered the Zuko station, and during the ceremony, her phone started acting up. That's from her article on it, and they make a big deal about donating a phone to science and forensically evaluating and so on and so forth, and that actually never really happened. From talking to Morgan, my understanding is she thought Zuko wanted this to eventually happen, but nothing did. And again, you've got a bunch of hard work you need to do to actually verify a system, and it's just not happening. And people aren't really saying this. And in fact, frankly, you can go around Twitter and find me prodding the Zcash team and getting other people to ask on my behalf, well, what happened to this phone? And frankly, I did know what happened, and I was waiting for them to go answer and see what they would do, and they just kind of said nothing. And I think what this leads to is really like risk denial. Again, here's Emin. There's some nutcases out there who are worried about Zcash trusted setup. 6 independent sources of randomness, et cetera, et cetera. This just isn't true. Hopefully now I've convinced you those sources of randomness just weren't independent. I don't really know what my compute node did. I don't think anyone is actually sure of this. I'm sorry, but this just isn't independent. And for us to be promoting this myth in public isn't really correct. And there's also issues just in general about the newness of the crypto. And I find this one really funny because, well, at that point, they'd learned about a massive crypto break in Zcash that made the entire thing inflatable. Now, to be clear, I'm not sure Matthew Green actually knew this at this point, but yeah, I think it goes to show, like, these things are risky. And we can't try to hide these kind of risks. We have to be honest about them. And we also got to be honest about how we communicate this stuff. What kind of impression are we giving people when we use security theater? Now, backstory here is, first, Zcash trusted setup. Obviously, there's some issues. And also, the crypto was relatively slow. Sufficiently slow as an example that, unlike, say, Monero, Zcash transactions aren't private by default. It was considered infeasible to just make every Zcash transaction private. So the second iteration of the crypto, they made a lot of improvements, sped it up dramatically. I think it's about 1 or 2 orders of magnitude faster than it used to be. These days you can send a Zcash transaction in a second or two. It is genuinely significantly better, but part of that process meant you had to run another trusted setup. And this time around, again, due to crypto improvements, much more people could participate in this, which I think is a great thing. This time around, I think the numbers were on the order of like 60 people participating rather than 6. And the way the math worked was essentially people could kind of come and go and keep adding their proofs and so on. But you still have this issue of, well, what are we saying to people when we go get a bit of radioactive toxic waste from Chernobyl and get a Geiger counter and do this, that, and the other. And when really, you got to go look at what you've actually done, which is, we took a random number generator that gives off a lot of radio waves, revealing what our actual random numbers are, and is easy to go and tap. What do people see when they read an article like this? They think, well, look how secure this is. When in reality, this is probably a lot worse than just mashing keys on a keyboard, which incidentally is how I generated the random numbers as my part of the ceremony. I got my fists and just bashed the keys till I was pretty confident no one knew. But again, this is security theater. And unfortunately, even like the internal communication about this still talked about in terms of security theater. Look at this cool thing we did, not, well, what are the actual risks here? There's other examples, like when, through the process of the Powers of Tau ceremony, at certain points they needed to go prove things about, when they did stuff. And I kept seeing them use open timestamps. And if you've been following the Open Timestamps Twitter account, well, I keep on reminding people, timestamping is often insufficient. My Open Timestamps project, all it does is prove something existed at a certain point in time. That's really not very much. So when you do things like say, well, we've got the ceremony and we've timestamped this, again, what are you saying to the public? What are you actually educating them about? And frankly, this worries me. And I think, overall in crypto, we need to do better. We need to communicate to the public what their risks are. We can't hype this stuff up. We have to explain when things can go fail. And we got to go do it in terminology that people will understand and get the right impression. If I were to do Zcash over, if that were my project, these days I might go and choose to just do a single party trusted setup and say, look, it's trusted, end of story. I'm sorry, but we don't kind of have the technology right now to do these things well. Because yes, we have this math, but what we don't have is the boring fundamentals of math. What computers do we run this on? Do we know what those computers do? What OSs do we have? How do we actually compile things? Until we do, I'm not sure that we should be talking about this kind of stuff in the language we do. I think we should really make clear to people, these things are risky. We don't have good answers. And there's a good chance you're going to go lose your money. Which, in their defense, yes, they say this stuff, but just like my disclaimers, these things get overshadowed by the rest of our actions. And if your disclaimers aren't getting listened to, well, maybe you should think more about what you're doing. And with that, thank you.